I'm Scott Radnitz, the director of the Ellison Center for Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies, and I'm happy to welcome everybody here tonight for the second annual Herb Ellison Memorial Lecture. Herb Ellison was a professor at the University of Washington for 34 years. He left a powerful legacy of teaching, mentoring, and research at the University of Washington, and worked throughout his life to build institutions to help Americans better understand the Soviet Union and Russia. Sadly, Professor Ellison passed away in October 2012. The center that bears his name is one of the nation's premier institutions for the interdisciplinary study of Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. With over 60 faculty affiliates, we offer languages, 14 languages of the region, and act as a local and national resource center for the study of the region. In 2004, our center received a generous endowment from the Ellison family, which allowed us to extend our reach in various ways. We expanded outreach to local schools, colleges, and nonprofit organizations. It allowed us to offer new language and topical courses. It allowed us to increase support of graduate studies and to be innovative to enhance regional and area studies to meet the demands of a changing world. Professor Ellison believed it was important to bridge the world of academia and policy to shed light on important issues of the day. He had a lifelong passion for Russia and the Soviet Union, and tonight we'll carry on both of these legacies. And that's why we're honored to have with us Jill Dougherty. Jill Dougherty is the foreign affairs correspondent for CNN and is based in the network's Washington, D.C. bureau. Jill previously served as the U.S. affairs editor for CNN International. Prior to that, she was the managing editor of CNN International Asia. In 1997, she was named CNN's Moscow bureau chief. She covered many significant events in Russia from that period, including the presidencies of Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin, Russia's economic transition, the Beslan school massacre, the conflict in Chechnya, the arrest and trial of Yukos Oil company founder Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Georgia's Rose Revolution, and Ukraine's Orange Revolution. Before her appointment as Moscow bureau chief, Jill was the CNN White House correspondent from 1991 to 1996. She joined the CNN originally as the Midwest correspondent in 1983, working out of CNN's Chicago bureau. In 1986, she was awarded the Benton Fellowship in Broadcast Journalism at the University of Chicago. She began her career as a broadcaster and writer for Voice of America, USSR division. Most importantly, Jill Dougherty earned a bachelor's degree in Russian language and literature from the University of Michigan. She plans to leave CNN at the end of this month to focus on speaking and writing about Russia. And she will be going to the Kennedy School at Harvard and accept a Shorenstein Fellowship to study the Russian media. So please join me in welcoming Jill Dougherty.
Thank you very much. Boy, I have to say thank you for that introduction. And I just wanted to say that I'm really honored to be here and to be able to look at the Ellison family right in front. It's truly an honor. Professor Ellison was a legend, and it's wonderful to be here and just excited and to meet you in person.
Well, we're happy you could join us today. I think a lot of people have seen you on TV at one time or another. You have a long and distinguished career. You've been on Air Force One numerous times, I assume. But what interests this audience the most is your experience with Russia. So I wonder if we could just start off by having you tell us a little bit about how you got into Russia, how you got drawn into the region.
Oh, boy. Well, I have to keep it short, but it begins when I was 13. I was in high school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a public high school that happened to have 4 years of Russian. And I have a twin sister, and we both were thinking, what should we study? You know, French, Spanish, German, or Russian? And it was really, you know, when you think, I hate to tell you when this was, it was a long time ago, but it was in the 1960s. And at that point, it was really kind of amazing. I was thinking of this recently. Sputnik, although that was in the 50s, the reverberations of Sputnik, you know, the first artificial satellite that went into space, Kennedy saying we have to match the Soviets, we have to put a man on the moon. That was all very much, you know, kind of in the zeitgeist. And so when Pam and I, who turned out to be inveterate apple polishers, decided that we would, study something, we thought Russian because it sounded exotic. Our father was an FBI agent, so of course you had to defend the country. So we decided to study Russian, and we got in there, and the professor started speaking Russian from the first day. And I was convinced he spoke no English. And I mean, it was frightening. He said, "Что это?" "Что это? Это карандаш, это стол, это стул." And we just went on from there. And he, just to keep it short, but he really did devote himself to the study of Russian. He was Russian. He was born in the United States, but his first language was Russian. His parents were Russian. And when we came to senior year, technically, he was not supposed to give a class for fewer than 6 people, but Pam and I were the only men standing, after 3 years. And he said, "Okay, you kids, if you really want to work hard, I'll give you my free period for you to study Russian, but you have to work really hard." So of course we said, yes, of course. So we had a year of like a person who was totally devoted to us, and we zipped along, and then majored in Russian. And those were the days that the government was giving money, this would be an ad, for studying foreign languages, critical foreign languages. Surprising. I think it ought to be going on, we've discussed this before, but I mean, I'm a big fan of learning critical languages. It changed my life, and it changed the lives of a lot of people who got into the Foreign Service and other organizations and the media.
And it's notable that you were also able to put this skill to use in,
Yes.
in your job as a reporter. Can you talk a little bit about how you rose through the ranks at CNN, and your employers must have known that you spoke Russian. Were you always angling for Moscow bureau chief? Was that kind of what you were aiming for, or did that happen by chance?
I think they knew that I was a more serious person because of the Russian. It just, who else, other than a masochist would study this language? So they probably thought, maybe she's got a little bit of a brain. But it had nothing to do with what I was doing. In fact, my very first job in TV, I quit. I worked for about a year. This was after The Voice of America. I was working in TV, and I became, I almost forgot about this. I was like a consumer reporter, trends or something, in Chicago, and I kept thinking, what am I doing here? And then they talked about doing this story about stores doing pre-Christmas stories before Thanksgiving. And I thought, I'm out of here. I quit. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I knew that I was interested, not, unfortunately, in domestic things, that I was interested in international things. So that's how I, eventually moved on. And then when I got to the White House, that was great. It was a great education. And at the end of that, they said, would you like to go to Moscow? And of course, it was perfect.
And the most interesting development, perhaps, came at the very end of your CNN career when you decided to go back for a master's degree at Georgetown University, which also gives a good lesson to people out there that it's never too late to further your education. So what year did you start your master's degree, and what was the logic behind that?
I think it took me about 100 years. But no, the problem was I was working at the State Department and covering Hillary Clinton, who had just come in as Secretary of State. And as you know, she was traveling a lot. So it was very hard to be able to study and predictably go to classes. And a lot of, the classes that I was going to, they said, if they're so compressed that if you miss one, I think they gave you like 2, if you missed 2 classes, you were out. So I had to really bargain, saying, look, I can't get out of going on this trip, but I will work extra hard, et cetera. So it took me quite a while, 4 or 5 years, I think, just doing one class at a time. But it was wonderful because I think in contrast, I probably should have done it when I was in my 20s, but the fact that I didn't, And going back with the experience that I had, I was able to see the pattern, you know? It wasn't like the trees. I could see the forest for the trees, and I could see the patterns that really meant something in international relations in Russia. And it was exciting, and I felt that my brain started to function again. And then I wrote my thesis on Russia's soft power diplomacy, which is a very hot topic. And with my own money, I went to Moscow, did interviews with people who develop Russia's foreign policy and, their soft power diplomacy. And it was a really interesting experience, Scott, because as I had a thesis, which was basically, Russia is going to use its soft power, but it doesn't have its act together. And eventually it will get its act together, but right now it doesn't know what it wants to say, which was a legitimate thesis. But halfway through that period, seriously, about 6 months into the period of working on it, I realized that they were getting their act together in a kind of PR, soft power, image way. And so, that changed the way that I ended. I rewrote the ending several times because of that.
So for the record, you got no special treatment as a graduate student. You were just like everybody else.
No, I was, yeah.
And there's a lesson also for students that if you take too long to finish your thesis, the world changes and you have to rewrite it.
Touche.
Yes.
Exactly right.
It's happened to the best of us.
Exactly right.
So in your research then, and in your reporting, a lot of what you've done with Russia focuses on the personality of Vladimir Putin. And
Yes.
he's a very interesting historical figure. And you've met him personally, and you've seen him up close.
I was kissed by Vladimir Putin.
I didn't know that
I
until
am
now.
not making this up, several months ago.
So maybe
Yes.
you can lend us some insight about what you've seen up close, what kind of observations you have that we might be missing when we see him from far away on TV. So who is this person, and what should we know about him?
Well, right at this very moment, I'm working on a half-hour special that will be kind of, I don't know the title yet. I'd better get it because it's going to air in a few weeks right before the Sochi Olympics. But it's essentially, working title would be Putin the Man, or maybe The World of Vladimir Putin, something. But it is not focused on foreign policy. It's not focused on big picture necessarily, or his domestic political situation. It's focused on Putin himself. So what we did, and this might be a way of answering that question, I was thinking, I sold this idea, and now I have to come up with a half hour. So the idea was, we think we know a lot about him. We think we know the bare-chested, macho man. But do we really know what formed him? What were the experiences in his life that made him who he is? So what I wanted to do was go back to where he came from. So we went to St. Petersburg, then at that point Leningrad. He was born in 1952. So, tail end of the war, he's post-war, but in Leningrad, and I can speak from personal experience because I was an exchange student in Leningrad in 1969 with no hot water in the dorms. So I can tell you that that period, the 50s and the 60s, were as if World War II was still going on. And Leningrad, a lot of you know, but Leningrad was subjected to a 900-day blockade by the Nazis in which they cut off everything. And people were reduced to eating, you can still see in some museums, you can still see the rations that they could have per day, which is a piece of bread about that big. And so Vladimir Putin's family had lived in Leningrad for a long time. His father went off to war, got shot up unmercifully. I mean, he was crippled when he came back, went to the front several times. His mother was literally starving to death. In fact, in his book, the book that was used to introduce him to people in about the year 2000, when people didn't know who he was, they had a book that was called First Person. And it was kind of an interview book, sitting down with Vladimir Putin around the kitchen table. And in that, he talks about being raised in this kind of slummy apartment, which we went to. You can't get into it because they actually have tours of Putin places, Putinsky места. But but you can't get into the apartment, but you can definitely stand outside of the building in the courtyard where he says in this book, he used to beat off rats with a stick. I mean, literally. And his mother was so starving during the war, he says, that she collapsed on the floor and they took her body and laid it out with corpses to be taken off to these common graves. And his little brother, who would actually be his older brother, died during the war as a little kid, I think of dysentery, as I remember. And they still don't know to this day where he's buried. And it might actually be in one of the big memorial cemeteries. So put this all together. This is a long way of answering your question, I'm sorry, but I think if you look at his World War II experience, or post just after the war, if you look at the feeling that a Leningrader who was proud that his family had survived, I think that Putin does not ever want this to happen again to Russia. I mean, on the wall at Piskaryovskaya Kladbyshe, which is the big memorial cemetery, there's a phrase, and I looked at it, I took a photograph really specifically of that. Никто не забыт, и ничего не забыто. So no one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten. So with Putin, who is using St. Petersburg as kind of the center for a lot of public diplomacy, you know, they had the G20 there, they had the G8 there, they've had a lot of international meetings. Leningrad/St. Petersburg is a symbol of Russia's revival. And I'm convinced that he will not have Russia denigrated again. And it motivates him a lot, you know? Mm-hmm. That, I would say that's psychology 101.
Yeah, so in looking deep into his psyche, you're basically attributing a real genuine motivation that he has to advance Russia's interests. A less generous interpretation might focus on corruptions, cronyism, patronage. Does the documentary that you're working on address that at all? And how do you kind of square the two?
You know, we don't really get into that because in a half an hour, if you take him from place to place, which we do, we take him, you know, to the city hall where he worked in the early administration of Sobchak. We take him to Moscow. We take him to judo class in St. Petersburg. Just an aside, where he said, you know, he's not very tall, as you probably know. He was constantly getting beaten up as a kid, and he took judo, and it changed his life, he says. And I actually believe that. He became very, very disciplined. Sports saved him from whatever he might have been, a tough guy. And so if you look at that, I think it was very hard to bring in, oh yes, and there's corruption. It's kind of, I felt, yes, we could have done it, but we wouldn't be able to do it very well because it wouldn't be kind of a very compelling personal story. So it's kind of in there, but it's not really dwelt upon.
Yeah. A lot of what we see of Putin is these staged images, right? These photo ops, the gestures, the salty language, right? A lot of the act that any politician really goes through to put out a public image of a person. So as a media person yourself, how do you go about describing or trying to understand what the Russian media strategy is? And how would you contrast that with the way that American politicians also try to present themselves to the public?
Well, let's put it in perspective. I think you have to take Boris Yeltsin and what was happening with the end of Boris Yeltsin. Unfortunately, a man who loved the bottle, person who had severe heart problems, constantly getting ill. I covered him and was constantly, you know, Yeltsin is dying. Every vacation I went on was, sorry, Jill, you have to come back. You have to break your vacation. He's dying. And I would say, again? So that was the context. A little bit crazy, politically, et cetera, not strong, and drinking. In comes Putin, relatively young, vigorous, doesn't really drink. He drinks green tea. And so I think this image of a strong leader was important in the beginning. I think he takes it seriously. Mm-hmm. I do think that he does like to fly with the cranes. He does like to, ride planes. He likes to ride fighter jets. But I think I think it's a lot from him. I've talked to people who've talked about those exploits, and they say it comes directly from him. So I think it's image management. Comes off a little bit strange in the West. Mm-hmm. I don't think, although I've seen, come to think of it, I've seen bathing trunk pictures of Obama early on, bare chest, so maybe it works. But I do think that, Russians like to see a vigorous, manly man as president.
Yeah. So that raises the question then of how much of that is for show, and how much of it is real in the sense that Putin really is in control, right? So there's this narrative in Russia that the government is trying to put out of the power vertical, right? Mm-hmm. He's the president. He sits on top of this unitary hierarchical structure that's efficient, that carries out his will. Mm-hmm. But people who've looked more deeply into Russian politics see a lot of different factions that are competing.
Absolutely.
People who used to be oligarchs have been absorbed into the state, also have power. And a lot of people say that Putin is not really in control. So how much of this public image is really designed to compensate for his lack of control?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, if you look at, remember Yeltsin, who was saying to the regions, take as much power as you want? And there was a lot of spreading out of power in Russia, politically and in many other ways. I think with Putin, immediately you see it. He stopped direct elections of governors, began to control a lot more, controlling political parties. And a lot of the most recent, maybe we'll talk about this later, but controlling the media, which is happening as we are speaking, this centralizing of the media. So I think that it's a very fragile control. It's not flexible. It is, I think there's an inability to deal with immediate challenges. Let's go back to the end of 2011, the beginning of 2012, the demonstrations. Mm-hmm. I think they were really shaken by those demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Because all of a sudden you had young people on the street, and not just young people, there were a lot of people on the streets demonstrating, and all of a sudden they were saying things that the government was shocked by. And remember in the beginning, they weren't quite sure how to deal with it. They allowed it to go on. It kept building. And then you started getting people arrested. There's still trials that have been taking place of people who were involved in that. And then at one moment, I think they felt that they kind of had it under control, mainly because it was so diverse and disparate. You had everything from nationalists to, Western people who would fit in just perfectly here, everything in between. And the idea was not, I would say the opposition would say, the idea was not to get a movement, but simply at that point to express the dissatisfaction from people. There was no one leader. And as soon as the Kremlin kind of got, after they were knocked on their heels, they started kind of getting the idea. Navalny, who was the leader, the blogger at that point, was influential, but also had a little bit of baggage about nationalism. And so eventually you could see the Kremlin kind of coming to its senses and trying to control it. But I do believe that is the biggest weakness right now of Russia. The inability to trust their own people, to trust young people, to trust people who want to do politics, who want to do real politics. They are absolutely fixated on controlling it from the top. And that, to me, as I use the word brittle, I really do think it's brittle. I think that it prepares you for, and I'm not saying revolution is coming tomorrow at all, but it prepares the ground for an unstable political environment in which you can have radical shifts. And they know that they have lost the big cities. You know, St. Petersburg, Moscow, definitely. Maybe some of the bigger cities. So the support, I was just looking at the numbers. His support right now is at 64%. But where is the support? You know, it's out in the hinterland. It's with people, you know, less educated, older, poor people who are very open to messages like the LGBT issue, et cetera. We'll probably talk about that later. But that again, to me, is a very unstable environment.
Mm-hmm. I should point out before I forget that you can tell that Jill is an experienced Russian speaker by the way she said Navalny. You use the soft sign for Navalny, which is something that Americans struggle with. And I'm not a linguist, but I think your pronunciation is spot
I did
on.
it just to impress the Russian speakers here.
I'm sure the audience appreciates that. So this is a good segue then into the issue of Russian-American relations. Mm-hmm. The protests coincided with or perhaps drove decline of the quality of American-Russian relations, which seemed to have improved from the beginning of the Obama administration, the so-called reset. And the last 2 years, they've taken a nosedive. Now, I know your thesis advisor, Angela Stent, has this argument that every new American president comes in hoping to establish a better relationship with his Russian counterpart, and each one is left disillusioned for one reason or another, and it looks like this has happened again with the current American president. So maybe the way to approach this question first is, whose fault is that? Or is this inevitable?
You know, I think an interesting way to answer that would be to let's pretend that we're Vladimir Putin. Let's pretend that we're Vladimir Putin for a moment and see how he looks at it. Because I think we kind of know how the US looks at it. Oh, how disappointing, they didn't do democracy. Putin is clamping down. I mean, you know, which is partially true, I think. But Vladimir Putin looks at it this way. He says, 9/11, 2001, I was the first international leader who phoned the US president to express my support. And what did I get? A slap in the face. They promised that they were going to, you know, work with us. And what did I get? Nothing, actually. Because what the United States does is the US basically is intent on acing us out of business around the world. The US is intent on, and this is all in quotes, okay, just in case.
We're role-playing.
Okay. Acing us out of hardware, military hardware, weapons, you know, supplies. Acing us out of countries where we used to have influence, as the Soviet Union or even early Russia. In other words, it's a zero-sum game, and I stuck my neck out for Bush, and what did I get? I didn't get much. And so I think there's a lot of that comes from Vladimir Putin. It's not a one-way street, whether you think that is correct or not. I think that's the way he looks at it. And other officials that I've talked to think the same way. So right now they're very cynical. I think they think that Obama is weak. Weak in the sense that Obama, you know, stretches out his hand to Iran. You know, Russians don't stretch out their hands. You know, to them, it's basically a zero-sum game. And so that's kind of, you know, Obama's willingness to deal with people sometimes is perceived as a weakness.
So early in the Obama administration, it looked like things were getting a bit better. So you could kind of date the lowest point of Russian-American relations to the Georgia War in 2008, which was the culmination of a lot of bad things, a lot of ill will that had been sort of building up. So Obama comes into office, they had the big red button with the reset. There was a mistranslation of the word, but they got over that pretty quickly.
I was at that pool, by the way.
For people who don't know, and you might even know who the State Department translator was who translated the word reset
I think it
wrong.
goes higher than the translator, but they're not saying.
Anyway, water under the bridge. The major successes of the reset, according to analysts, are two things: the START II treaty, right, arms reductions, and the Northern Distribution Network, which is this transit network to ship things in and out of Afghanistan through Central Asia and Russia. But then things got worse, as they inevitably do, and it seemed to, again, coincide with the protests. Was this something that was inevitable, or was this the most expedient and convenient strategy that Putin had available at that time in order to, what we might say, appeal to his base?
And the strategy being?
Strategy being scapegoating the West. Using the West as a foil in order to strengthen people around an idea of strengthen his position around an idea of Russian nationalism, Russian values.
Well, you had the election going on. You know, Putin, in his various guises as president, prime minister, and president again, you had elections coming in which Putin did, I think, want to play to the base. In fact, I did speak with one senior administration official who said that the Russians during the latest election were saying, I know it's getting kind of anti-American. This is not a quote, obviously, but there's a lot of rhetoric out there. We've got to do that. It's an election. You do the same thing, playing to your base. But after the election, it's going to be okay. And what he said was, it was never okay. It never came back to normal. Now, why Putin's doing that? I think partly it is currying favor and shoring up his base permanently. Because as Russia opens up, young people, are on the web. They're not watching TV, which is the way the government influences people by TV. A lot of young people are not watching TV. They needed, I think they really felt that they were losing some of the discussion. And so they had to, I think, create more domestic support. And what better way to do it than by anti-American whipping up things? And part of it is, you still have, in both countries, you have Cold Warriors who are still in positions of responsibility. You have them in the Defense Department to a certain extent, but I would argue the Defense Department is, pretty hip when it comes to, the reality of the situation. I think on Capitol Hill, you have a lot of people who are lost in the Cold War. And even if they're 30 years old, their mindset is way back. And in Russia, you have a bad situation because the parliament, is ineffectual, certainly under control of the Kremlin. But there was a lot of punishing. I'll give you an example. The Magnitsky Act, which you probably know about, making it very difficult for, sanctions against people who were involved in Russia in the death of a Russian businessman, Sergei Magnitsky. The US Congress decided that they wanted to give up most favored nations, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. I won't get into too much history, but Magnitsky bill comes along. I am talking to a member of Congress, and I said, oh, well, why are you doing this Magnitsky bill? I mean, why not just forget about, the Cold War? Why not give most favored nation status to Russia and begin trading? It would be the best thing. And he said, well, we're going to get rid of Jackson-Vanik, there's no question, but we need something to hit them with. And I'm, quote, we need something to hit them with, like a stick. And that really shocked me because I thought there are other countries that are more egregious in their violations of human rights and a lot of other things than Russia. Why do you need to punish them? But it was still the idea, we can't trust them. We have to have something, ready just in case they act up. And there's the same mentality in Russia.
So you think at least Congress tends to hold Russia to a different standard than they would other countries?
Absolutely.
What about the U.S.
Not all of
media?
it.
What about the way that the media covers Russia? Do you think that they make the same kind of mistake? Do you
Just
think
as
there's a tendency to fall into Cold War tropes a little bit too
Just
easily?
as bad. There's no question. I mean, look at it this way. One day I was in the booth we have a little booth, a CNN booth, at the State Department. And it's about as big as this stage, maybe, actually it's probably smaller. And I'm looking at the screen, the monitor, and there's an ad for a new show. And it's I think it's the Fox one. It's about the Russian spies, I'm forgetting the name. The Russian spies who live in the United
next door. The Americans.
Yeah, the Americans. Okay, this is right when they're beginning to promo this. So I look up and I see the hammer and sickle. And I thought, hammer and sickle, where did that come from? What is this? So I'm looking at the ad and I thought, the sexiest thing that you can imagine, at least for like images of bad people, is the hammer and sickle. You can't beat it. And you can't beat a KGB agent for intrigue. And you can't beat a narrative that you understand. But, the Cold War was perfect because it was very kind of hot images, easy to, even though it was a Cold War, but visually very hot images, lots of spies, lots of, like Anna Chapman type spies. Sure. Seducing, the FBI agent.
So very cinematic.
Very cinematic,
sure.
Very simple. And when you get into the real world today, how do you understand terrorism? How do you understand what's going on? It's very complex. So I think that in the media, we fall back egregiously into these preconceived notions of what Russia is. And it bothers me because it makes it very difficult to report because, you try to say something that goes against that narrative and people either don't think it's interesting, like, why are you boring us with all this background? Why don't we just get a hammer and sickle and talk about that? So I'm serious, I find it like even questions that I'm asked on air are like, oh, please, do we have to go there again?
Yeah, so some have tried to transcend these old Cold War narratives. In the Obama administration, Michael McFaul was the special advisor for Russia, then became the ambassador. Today he's the U.S. ambassador to Russia, has tried sort of unconventional approaches for a diplomat, in particular using social media to try to reach the Russian people directly. The ambassador has stumbled a few times. He's a professor, so he wasn't trained in diplomacy, and professors have a tendency to not watch what they say very well. How do you think that approach is? He speaks Russian very well. He's an expert on Russia, and he's trying out something a little bit different. Do you think is this an approach that could work in diplomacy in general? Was he just the victim of bad timing that he happened to be ambassador while Putin needed to scapegoat the West?
I think there was a lot of the bad timing, plus who he was, because he came to Moscow. I remember this very well. He came to Moscow right at that moment that there was kind of like an anti-American narrative. Then the new guy comes. He knows Russia very well, but what is his expertise in? Human rights, democracy promotion. Right at the moment that they're beginning to crack down on civil society. And these, Hillary Clinton is funding revolution in Russia. It was all at that time. So McFaul comes in, and there's a great piece of video. You can just, go onto YouTube and you'll find it, where a nice reporter whom I had seen a few weeks before in Moscow, the election, I was covering the election. I'm sorry, again going on, but it was just perfect. I'm covering the election. I'm at a polling station, and I saw this young journalist. She has red hair, from NTV, and I thought, this is really, it warms the cockles of my heart to see a young journalist in there, you know, reporting, and a few weeks later, I see young journalist, redhead woman, going up to Mike McFaul and grilling him and luring him into a conversation that probably he never should have gotten involved in. Like, what are you doing? Why are you, Mr. Ambassador, why are you meeting with this dissident, you know, in this building? And McFaul, because he really loves to engage and he's a professor, begins to speak in Russian, debating this 22-year-old, reporter, but the ambassador should not be debating a reporter on the street.
Well, she set a trap for him. It was an ambush,
Absolutely.
and they baited him.
It was
and
ambush
took the bait.
journalism.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, it was really bad. They wanted to get him, and no matter what he does, it's been very difficult.
I realize so it's been 45 minutes. I should say that we're going to take questions from the audience. Index cards were passed around, and so we ask you to write questions if you have any on those cards. And so please raise your hand so that you can get a card if you don't have one. And then a little bit after 8 o'clock, I'll take some of your questions. Since we are short on time, we have to talk about the Olympics.
Oh, yes.
So the timing is excellent to have you here because you've been reporting on the lead up to the Olympics. Russia is in the spotlight in ways that doesn't happen very often. The Olympics are very important to Vladimir Putin. What do you think he wants to get out of the Sochi Olympics first and foremost?
Well, number one, he wants to make sure that they don't get attacked by terrorists. You know, of course, that goes without saying. But it's a serious issue because the head, so-called, of, his name is Umarov, has vowed and encouraged people to destroy the Olympics. So it's a very serious challenge. But I think, you know, that aside, what he wants to do, where is he holding the Olympics? He's holding the Olympics in a place that is closer to Tehran than it is to Moscow. Interesting. So he's holding it in an area, Sochi, Russia, Black Sea resort, kind of like the Miami of the Soviet Union, you know, palm trees, beautiful weather, vacation spot for Soviet officials and Russian officials. He's been down there a lot. Beautiful. So the narrative, I would say, again, as a person who's in the media, oh my goodness, I didn't know they had palm trees in Russia. That's one thing I would say. Oh my goodness, I didn't know they had mountains that are gorgeous. Because they do have mountains that look like Switzerland, the Caucasus, with very beautiful skiing, you know, plenty of snow, at least most of the time. We don't know whether they'll have enough snow, but they'll make snow. So you know, why not hold the Winter Olympics in Siberia? You know, plenty of snow. Because it would just play into the narrative of Siberia and the Gulag and everything. So you hold them in a place that is counterintuitive. The image is very nice. You also hold the Olympics in a place that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious. You know, it's an area with a lot of Islamic influence. There are a lot of Muslims in that area. What else? You know, you hold them successfully. You have opening, I can't wait to see the opening of the Games. It's going to be spectacular, and for $51 billion, it should be spectacular. The most money that has ever been spent on the Olympics in the history of mankind, $51 billion. So the opening will be, I am sure, what Russia is to the world. Friendly, multi-ethnic, hip, heartwarming. It will have everything. It will have the dancing babushki, you know, the women who sing. It will have, I'm sure it'll have young, hip people. It'll probably have some version of, I don't know, you know, whatever that you would call break dancers, but that kind of, you know, that type.
And a cute little bear mascot to emphasize the warm and fuzzy aspects of Russia, which we all know and love.
Exactly.
So what do you think then are the best case scenario and worst case scenario for Putin, personally? Again, to role play.
You mean for the Olympics?
For the Olympics.
Worst case, big terrorist attack, multiple casualties. They are unable to deal with casualties, a complete mess. I think any terrorism at the venue would be really bad because they have that lockdown with security like you've never seen. Our FBI is there helping them. Not that they provide security, but they are advising them on ways of dealing with this. And diplomatic security for the State Department will be protecting U.S. athletes. So I'm not as worried about the venue. I would be more worried about terrorist acts outside of there, like the Volgograd attacks that took place recently, or Moscow, St. Petersburg. So that would be the worst. Also bad would be some sort of uncomfortable LGBT event. Unfurling flags. I don't know what the gay salute is, but some, we won a medal and this is for all the LGBT people out there. That would be embarrassing for him. What else? I think those would be the bad things. The good thing would be no terrorist activity. So you can read, Russia's able to protect itself. LGBT, as Putin said, you're all welcome. Anybody who wants to come, no problem. Come on down, participate. We're open, even though we don't like your lifestyle. But come on down. And I think also, seriously, the multi-ethnic, multi-religious image of Russia, a soft power approach is what he really wants to get across.
How important is it that Russians win the most medals of any country? And will he be upset? And what kind of punishment will come to athletes who don't perform up to their abilities?
Scott, I actually hadn't even heard of it. I thought of it because I've been paying more attention to, terrorism, LGBT, what will happen, the, international dimensions. I suppose they'll do pretty well.
Sports is also pretty important in Russia.
And it's a winter
so they should
sport
have an edge.
land.
They should have an edge
They'd
there that they
better
might
do
not have in
well.
the Summer Olympics.
They'd better do well.
And is there a story about the Olympics that we're not being told? Is there kind of an edgier side of the story of making Sochi an international city? Something that we're not hearing in the media that we did hear a little bit before the Beijing Olympics about how they tried to manage pollution, about home demolition in order to build new stadiums.
Yeah.
Are there things going on in Russia that Americans should know about if we want to get a bigger picture?
I really think that, and this is a very good place where a lot of people are interested in the environment, that is a beautiful area. And in order to build between the main venue and the mountains, they're building kind of a railway. A lot of the construction for roads in and the communication between the venue, the main site, the city, and the mountains had to be built from scratch. And all you have to do is Google some of these stories. I mean, there has been a lot of corruption, enormous amount of corruption reported for people who've been carrying out these big construction jobs. And it's supposed to be the greenest Olympics ever, but at the same time, there are reports of polluting the aquifer that provides water, pristine, beautiful water to the area, and corruption. So that it's really a very sad aspect of all of this.
And then on the issue you brought up recently, this has been in the news a lot also, the official language, I believe, is ban on propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations.
To minors.
To minors, yes.
Yes.
So what lay behind that law, and do you think the Russian government misunderstood or perhaps underestimated the amount of outrage that would generate across the world?
They may have misunderstood, but I don't think they care too much about it. I mean, in a way they care because, if people feel that internationally that either gay athletes or gay visitors will be arrested, that's not good for Russia's image. But in the sense that I don't think they really care that much about people who think that it's outrageous. I really don't. because it works well in Russia. Russia's a very conservative country. I mean, Moscow and St. Petersburg are not Russia as a whole. And so that LGBT issue in small villages, small towns, works. And if you look at statistics, if you look at the polling, people really do think that it's dangerous. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Moscow and asked a question of Putin at the press conference, the 4-hour press conference. And I asked him, really, what is this criticism of Western values? Why are you criticizing the West so much? I don't remember it. And he defended it. And he said, essentially, I'm a staunch conservative. That's what I believe. And we are, in our country, we are against people who impose their views or their values, their lifestyle, on us. And so that's how he looks at it. I think he believes it. I actually think he believes it, but I also think that they are able to manipulate and exploit that issue to create a lot of support. I'll say one other thing. It plays well in Russia among conservative people. It also plays well among Muslims who may not share, the Christianity, obviously, approach that Putin is taking. Bastion of Christianity, Europe is decadent, we're the bastion of civilization and Western Christendom, et cetera, that he's now talking about. But I think it plays well in the Muslim world, among conservatives who don't believe in gay rights, obviously, and even in Africa, where you can see what's happening in Uganda with the new laws. So I think there's another side to this gay law, which is really, I think, winning him some support, or at least he aspirationally, he hopes that it will win support, again, in a soft power way in the Middle East and in Africa, which are places where he lost a lot of the support that the Soviets had. Remember, in the Soviet Union, they were out, at post-colonial message to countries after the end of the colonial period. Yeah. So I think he can recoup. He feels he can recoup some of that support.
Kind of soft power through intolerance.
Yes. Well put.
Very innovative.
Well put. That's a good bumper sticker.
That's great. Yes. Yes. Could run for re-election maybe and win. So most of the stories that we hear in the Western press are these human rights stories. So there's this issue, Pussy Riot, Magnitsky, but there's the lawyer who died in jail. When Americans hear about these stories and become outraged, and this includes Congress and the media, people who might even have some influence, is that perhaps falling into the trap of the people who do these things in Russia? Do they seek to generate moral outrage in the West, which then kind of confirms what they're already saying to their people, which is that the West is against us, and helps to create the sense of being under attack, right? And helps them to consolidate power. And are there things that, so Americans get outraged when Americans want to do something, but is it something that's counterproductive to campaign on behalf of people in another country who you maybe really can't help, or at least the kinds of things that you're able to do aren't going to be helpful?
That's an interesting way of looking at it. I know there is that boomerang effect that the more we criticize them, the more they dig in their heels. And I think so that's kind of counterproductive. But I am not convinced that they are doing this just to anger the United States. It might be part of it. It would be kind of a sophisticated way of doing it. But I really think that they are worried about civil society, non-governmental organizations that are outside the control of the central government. Because when you have that, I mean, this is Mr. Power vertical. Putin is a consummate person who's created what they do call the power vertical. So the government is not, individual organizations and citizens getting together and eventually putting pressure on the government. It's all top down. And he is a big believer in that. Now, why he thinks that's good, I think he feels genuinely feels that the country would fall apart if Russians were left to their own devices. And I've had conversations like this with members of the government who really believe that Russians are an unruly lot, undisciplined, and unless you really keep them in line, they will create all sorts of havoc. So for the good of the Russian people, we have to save them from themselves.
So it's a strong state or it's chaos.
Absolutely.
Nothing in between.
And remember, in fairness, Russia could have fallen apart in '91. It really could have been a failed state, and it wasn't. So Putin is very focused on keeping that country together.
We have only a little bit of time left before I collect some questions, so I want to ask you a few final questions about the news business. In particular, coming from your expertise as an international specialist, how do journalists like you go about communicating international stories to American audiences that either don't care or don't know very much about them? That's a very loaded question. You can answer that as you want to.
No, I mean, it is a problem because a lot of these, stories like the stories about Russia do seem far away. Russia is not in the news as much right now. It's in a lot. But for a long time, there was kind of a quiescent period where Russia really wasn't in the news. And, Americans have a lot of issues of their own, so why should they care? And I asked myself that because I'm hooked, I'm interested. Why should they care? So I try to make them as human as possible, to try to make them as understandable as possible, and to try to give them the understanding that what happens in Russia actually will affect the United States. And, Syria is an example. The Syrian chemical weapons would be an example of, if the United States really wants to try to alleviate the horrible suffering of the people in Syria, it needs help from Russia. And, the Russians coming up with this idea, kind of semi-hatched before, about getting rid of Syria's chemical weapons, that's good, and there are other things that we can work on. So I try to just kind of keep it as human and as basic as possible and less theoretical. Again, I always try to avoid the Cold War idea as much as I can because it's a very complex country.
Right, but it's easy to fall into that narrative. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, did that make your job easier because she's a celebrity and people would be interested in what she does wherever she is? And through her, then you could tell a complicated, difficult international story.
Yeah, I think that really is true. Because Hillary, right in the beginning, when she came, the foreign policy was out there, but a lot of our stories were, what's it like to be with Hillary Clinton? What does she want to accomplish? Oh my goodness, there she is on the plane again. She flew 1 million miles, basically 1 million miles. There's Hillary in her glasses, reading her briefing books. There's Hillary doing shots, in some time, dancing, whatever. There were a lot of personal stories, but it did increase the interest, certainly.
So what are you implying about John Kerry?
I think he can dance. I mean, I've never seen it, but I believe he probably can. Kerry has become his own interesting person because he's fixated on solving Middle East peace. I mean, right now, he's involved in that. I think Middle East peace, Hillary Clinton, maybe because of the times, too. It's a little unfair. There is that narrative that she didn't want to get involved because it was a thankless task. And in order to increase her viability in 2016, she didn't try to solve Middle East peace. That might be part of it, but I think the times were different. She had other things that she was trying to do. But I think Kerry is really energetic, and he has nothing to lose. So in that sense, it's interesting. He's interesting because he's the type of guy, because he was a senator, who feels that he can kind of walk into a room and do a deal. He was a deal maker for Obama, remember, in Afghanistan and a lot of other places. So it will be interesting to see what, finally he can accomplish on Middle East peace and Iran, those two.
So now that you're leaving CNN, there's one less serious journalist who specializes in foreign affairs out there. What is then the future of television news, especially when it comes to covering international stories? And CNN is kind of an interesting case because there are still serious journalists. So Christiane Amanpour, for example.
Absolutely.
You have Fareed Zakaria's show, which is a very serious foreign policy show. But now CNN also has Anthony Bourdain.
Right.
Who's serious in his own way, but it presents...
And great.
And very good at what he does. And he also presents a view of the world and brings the world, places that most tourists will never go, right to the viewer. So is the future of CNN more like Bourdain or more like what you do and are leaving and what Christiane Amanpour does?
Christiane is her own person. Like, Christiane is an institution. And I think she is fantastic. And I think no matter what she does, she will always have eyes on her. She's a real celebrity, and she's really earned her stripes. Bourdain is very good at what he does. TV, though, the focus right now is on the web. The web is driving TV. So I think if you look at the web, you can get anything that you want. You can get sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or you can get news about Russia, or you can get news about whatever you want. So I think it's going to be more, you go to CNN as a source that you trust. You will probably go through the web, and then you will go on to whatever you want, watching videos or whatever. But it's going to be more like your web experience, which is very individual, tailored to what you're interested in. And if you're not interested in Anthony Bourdain, you don't even have to know that he exists, because you're going to experience CNN through the web. So as I'm leaving, I can definitely see this in full, blossom, that the media world has changed very much. So that what's on TV, it's interesting. There are more appointment viewing shows like Anthony Bourdain, but you'll still be able to get your hard news, but you will you'll go in through your own little portal, and you will look for Christiane, and you look for a security clearance blog, which I wrote for, and other things, but it will be a different experience.
What advice then would you have for a student who wants to go into journalism and uses you as a model for what they'd like to achieve? Is that model of reporter still possible, or do they have to do something different?
I think they're going to have to do something different, but it's really more the expression of what they do and the platform for what they do rather than what they actually do. I mean, if there is still money to send people abroad, and CNN still does send people abroad to report the way nobody else does. Certainly among American networks, there's no comparison. We still spend a lot of money to send people to Syria, to be right in the midst of a horrible war. We still have people in Russia. We still have people in the Middle East all over, and Asia, et cetera. So I think for a young journalist, you should really follow your heart, because I think that your heart is going to be, your specialty can be expressed in a way maybe that it wasn't before. There are probably other people who are interested in what you're interested in. And before, it was more homogenized, right. You had to kind of do news generally, and then you could go off and work in another country. But I would say, know as much about the subject that you're interested in as possible, learn languages if possible, try to work abroad, get a job, making it very clear that you would want to have that experience. But the platform for you will probably be, web-based. There are just opportunities on our web, on CNN.com, to write about whatever you want. I mean, I could write till the cows come home about Russia, and there would be appetite for it. So in that sense, it's really great, because on TV, there's not unlimited appetite for Russia.
Right. Okay, I'm going to put my questions aside, and we'll take
do
some
it.
questions from the audience. Very good question. What is your opinion of the Russia Today network, or RT? Is it propaganda or real news?
Is that a trick question?
I don't know. It's from the audience.
I think there's only one answer. I do not believe, and I'm sorry to say this because I know some of the people there, I don't believe it's real news. I really don't. I think they started out, RT started out as Russia Today. It was supposed to be reporting on Russia. It no longer reports on Russia. It reports on the United States. And watch it, almost every single story is critical of the United States. I was watching it very carefully a few weeks ago when I was in Moscow. And there's a lot of ferment right now. The head of RT, who's a young woman, very successful at what she does, has now gone over to this new entity, which is called Russia Today, which you probably know, was just created out of the, RIA Novosti, which is like an AP, Associated Press, wire service. It's been around forever. And their version of Voice of America. They ended them, they're about to end, and they created this new entity that's called Russia Today. And so this woman, Margarita Simonyan, who's now the head of RT Television, has moved over to them. So all of this is under control of the Kremlin. This is stuff that I'm going to be looking at very carefully when I do this fellowship. I'm going to be trying to understand what exactly is going on in the Russian media. But from what I can tell right now, heavy on centralization and centralized control.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can always tell watching RT what Russia wants the message to be. They cover stories at first glance in an objective, straight way, but there's always a little hint of something else.
Or not so little.
And it depends on the topic,
No, really.
I guess, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a lot of great questions here, and I hope some of these are my former
fast.
students because they're really smart. Okay, so
Let's talk fast.
I'm going to try to cover things that we haven't talked about before. So this question is about demographics. Have you seen any concern in Russia for some of its deeper non-political problems that are often not reported in the U.S. media, demographic collapse, et cetera, and public health issues in general? I might also add alcoholism, HIV, AIDS.
Oh, yeah, problems. Well, demographics, they're losing population. The population is aging. One of the rationales for the gay law is that gays don't procreate. Surprise, tell it to my friends who have children. But in any case, they don't procreate. So that's a problem. So this is actually used as justification for the gay law, the anti-gay law, that they don't have children, therefore they're not upholding their part of, creating the Russian generations of the future. So they're very worried about that. They are increasing financial aid and other aid for people who have multiple children. I think they're worried about HIV. I haven't seen that they're doing that much in that area, unfortunately, and drug use is very tied to that. It's a real problem.
At least you can say that Russia's one step ahead of Iran, right, which claims that there are no gay people in the country.
Exactly.
So here's a question about the former Soviet republics in the near abroad. Can Russia allow Ukraine and Georgia to switch to the European Union's economic influence? And this gets at the issue of the protests that have been going on in Ukraine. I might add to that, what is it that seems to drive Russia so nutty when it comes to its former republics talking to Europe?
Well, I mean, Ukraine is a huge issue. Don't forget that was one of the manufacturing centers, also the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. And to see, put yourself in, again, the mentality in Moscow, to see Ukraine going to the EU is galling. And also, there are a lot of people, Ukraine is split down the middle, really, between the Western side, which is very European, and the Eastern side, who many of them, speak Russian. identify with Moscow. So it's a very difficult dilemma. And the president, shorthand, tried to play both sides against the middle, the EU and Russia, and realized that it wasn't going to work with the EU. They required too much economic reform. And so he's thrown his lot, but not quite, with Moscow. So we'll see how this works out. But it's very sad to see Ukraine where it is right now, because economically it's in very bad shape. I think, the bigger picture, Putin wants to reestablish what he's creating right now, which is that customs union, bringing together parts of Central Asia and Ukraine and trying to bring them back into some semblance of his own EU, something that can compete with the EU.
The question is whether Russia's going to get its $15 billion worth from this loan to Ukraine.
Absolutely
which
right.
I think wouldn't be considered soft power, right? Money's pretty hard.
Money is
it's
hard.
fungible, but
yep.
it's
However,
costly.
it's usually considered part of soft power because you bribe people to do things.
Ah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
will
according to
will that win
Nye,
hearts and minds in Ukraine?
yeah. We'll see. We'll see. Can they pay it back? Good question.
What is your take on the crackdown on immigrants? Is this to appease the far right, or is there more to it?
There's more to it. It's really bad. Shorthand, a lot of people from the former republics came to Moscow, big city, jobs, get paid better, living in horrible conditions, a lot of them, exploited workers. They don't speak Russian. They stick out like a sore thumb. Some of them, they're exploited, but a few carried out some crimes, exploited by Russian nationalists to say these are horrible people. We have to crack down on them. And I think it's a big concern. So it's a combination of, it's very similar to the Mexican debate that goes on in the United States. Right. These people coming in to take our jobs, they're uneducated, and not to mention the fact that, of course, they're exploited in many cases. And the same animosity, and then you have almost pogroms against these people from former Soviet republics. I think the government sincerely is worried about it because it is kind of letting the genie out of the bottle in terms of reprisals that can really get out of hand.
Dangerous. Let's see. There was a question about Syria. Okay, based on your insight into Russia, could you speak to the role of Russia in the Syrian civil war, particularly going forward?
They have no love lost for Assad. They have old ties to Assad. They're worried about the United States doing what it did in Libya. They don't like Arab Spring countries that have, they don't like Arab Spring. They're worried that the United States ultimately, although look at poor Syria now, what's left? What is left? But I think that there's a lot of, concern about it collapsing, which it seems to be rapidly doing. And so that, I think, is actually a good thing that Russia really does seem legitimately motivated to help solve it, I hope.
This issue, and also with Iran and sanctions, are areas of potential and actual cooperation between Russia and the US. And even while relations might get bad rhetorically, as the two sides say nasty things about each other, over this whole period, they've still been able to cooperate, mostly in security issues where they have common interests. That kind of raises the question of how much a lot of the sniping and rhetoric is actually kind of a charade, because both countries really understand they have to work together on certain issues. And is the rhetoric really mostly intended for domestic audiences in both countries?
But, I don't think that they do and they don't understand. Really, we're talking about the United States, that some people do in Congress understand, and certainly I think the administration understands that you need Russia to help solve a lot of issues. But when it comes down to really working with them, there are a lot of bigger fish to fry for this administration. So that Russia becomes a little tangential sometimes, I think, unfortunately. And there's a feeling that you can kind of that you can kind of do what you want and Russia will accept it. And Russia gets on its high horse when it feels that it's being talked down to and that it's not respected. And they perceive that there's a lot of disrespect. And then the same thing in Russia, you know, we have to work with them, but we don't trust them because after all, they're trying to take advantage of us and they want our natural resources. And, you know, I saw once a photograph, a doctored photograph that this organization was passing out, and it had American military people on Red Square in night vision goggles. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, you know, they want to take our resources away from us. And so they're going to be on Red Square very shortly. I told them it's not true, but you never know.
You never know. On the topic of natural resources, and it's striking, there's so much to talk about, we haven't even talked about energy yet.
Oh boy.
So here's the question. How much has Putin's rural base benefited from Russia's oil-fired economic growth? Is poverty of the hinterland a serious political weakness?
Oh.
Maybe start
yes to both.
How much has energy trickled down and benefited ordinary people in Russia?
I don't think a lot. I think, although I do, you know, smaller big cities like Yekaterinburg or some other cities, you know, you can feel the influence of money coming into these areas. They actually, I think, are growing. But remember, the Soviet Union, that economy that said, you will produce widgets here, and you'll produce other widgets over here, and a very inefficient model has created these cities that have nothing to produce right now in the real world. And so you have people with nothing to do. And you have extremes of wealth in Moscow and St. Petersburg and extremes of poverty in other cities. That's why they need a more diversified economy. And until it stops being energy, 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 and they get some of the smart young people who are in Silicon Valley, gets them back in Moscow working, you know, they're losing out.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question about Afghanistan. It's kind of a many-part question. I'll try to simplify it. So with the withdrawal of NATO troops from Afghanistan, let's end it like this. What are the security threats to Russia? And does Russia have a plan for what happens after NATO withdraws and things potentially could go downhill?
I think they're worried. I think they're definitely worried. They did really want, even though initially they said, you know what, United States, you're going to fall into the same trap that we did. Because we went in and we got our ex kicked, and the same thing's going to happen to you. And I think they really do believe that. I think they feel that the United States fell into the same problems that they had and had to ignominiously withdraw. And I think they're worried about that flank. I think they're worried about growing Islamist threat. I think they're worried about their own Islamist threat. And I think they're worried about what happens in that very area to the east of Sochi. You know, Chechnya, it's cleaned up, it's kind of pacified, but Dagestan, center of terrorism right now, really bad. I think they're worried about that. But let's get started about China, because that actually, as a big, threat, economic threat, they would even say demographic threat. They don't know. It's almost like, let's not talk about China. It's too scary.
So Russia
Really?
has a lot to worry about, in other words. Let me ask you a question that I'm sure is on everybody's minds. Do you have any insight into what Edward Snowden's future plans are?
He's becoming a world statesman. Have you noticed?
I know.
Yeah. I don't know. Where does he go next? Or does he settle in Russia? What does he do? There was that talk about his going to Brazil. Be nice. I think life would be nice in Brazil.
We're hoping you would have a scoop on the issue. That's why I
don't. I really don't. But I was thinking about him when I went through the airport just a couple of weeks ago. I was thinking, okay, I wonder where he is. I think he marries, the idea was he should marry Anna Chapman.
Yes.
I think that would be very nice.
That would be good for a
Great story.
reality show. Do you have any predictions about Russia that you'd like to go on the record with in front of the whole world?
Well, prediction. Okay, who knows? I mean, every day is a new adventure there. But I would say, look for Russia's projection of its soft power and its image. That I think they're getting their act together, in at least hoping that they can influence the world. With Russia's soft power, its culture, et cetera. I think that you're going to see more proactive movement by Russia on a number of fronts. They're already involved in Syria, obviously, Iran, and maybe some other world problems that they will try to help to solve. So I think you're going to see more active foreign policy of Russia. I think there's going to be a lot more image projection. This new media organization, whatever it turns out to be, will have a message that it's going to try to impart. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about Russia, just in terms of their getting their act together and their image together.
And then to bring this back home, maybe for the final question, because people in this room obviously care a lot about Russia, and we teach about it. You're now going to devote yourself to studying, writing, and speaking about Russia full time. What are you going to do to keep Russia in the limelight? What are you going to do to make sure that people continue to focus on this region while they're distracted with not only if they're interested in the world, other hotspots like the Middle East or China, but of course tweeting and Facebooking and other things they might be doing?
I would say what I'm going to try to do seriously is I'm going to try to follow what young Russians are doing. I'm going to be on the web. I'm going to try to talk about Russia, believe it or not, like a normal country. I know they think they're special, but they are human beings, and I think that they can be reported on. That was a joke, by the way. I think they can be reported on as a real country with real people, and not in all of these capital letters. Everything about Russia is just, there's so much history and there's so much, as I said, these images that we can't seem to get rid of. And what I'd like to do is find out about, young people like why are they in Silicon Valley? Seriously, why are there tens of thousands of Russians in Silicon Valley? Why aren't they in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities? What's the real reason? I'd like to know. I'd like to know why Russian pop culture is very big within Russia, but it doesn't seem to be popular around the world. Why can't they kind of talk? They can in the near or abroad, but they can't really get out there. Why aren't, I mean, this doesn't sound that serious, but I'm very intrigued. Why are they only formal classical culture, ballet, opera, and their popular culture, which is pretty, vibrant? Why is nobody listening to Russian music, Russian, popular music? Why? I don't know, but I'd like to find out. So in other words, I'm going to try to treat it not as this kind of, I hate this word, but it's kind of like the fuddy-duddy approach to Russia, which is, there's a serious country out there, right. With a history, and they were coming. I'd like to treat it like a normal country and find out what they're up to, because the young people are really defining it, but they're not getting out to, the Americans don't know they exist,
Yep.
So I'd like to get that across.
I think we'd all love hearing about that as well.
Thanks.
So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you,
I'd also
Scott.
like to thank Ellison Valadze for helping to set all of this up.
Yes.
So please join me in thanking Jill Dougherty for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Great job, Scott. Thank you.